Thank you very much.
I didn't say, can you also introduce yourself?
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been a very great talk. Thank you, Minister Plowman. My name is Nicole Petruba. I work at King's College London and also for Fundamental SDG, a global initiative for mental health in the SDGs. We were very delighted to see that the United Nations have finally included mental health in the United Nations SDGs. Now, as you said, Minister Plowman, the indicators are crucial for including those that are left most behind. I was wondering what your position is towards mental health and how we can include those that are, the WHO estimate 450 million people are currently disabled because of mental illness. What is your position to that, please?
Thank you very much. If you could pass to the gentleman in front here.
Thank you. My name is Kudakwasha Kanutu. I'm from Durham University. I just wanted to raise the point of the do no harm principle, which I believe the ODI subscribes to. For me, it feels like a racket that we are talking about the poor in Africa, but there's been a contribution from these states. So, for example, I'm thinking about the sanctions on Zimbabwe, where I'm from. This creates inequality, but this is based on the fact that the West is in disagreement with the president, but the president has done good things, like in terms of gender. When we were growing up, it was that there was a decree that if you can only send one kid to school, either send the girl if you've got a boy and a child. So he really has done something towards that. So my point is, I'm trying to raise the point that you should also think in terms of the do no harm principle when you think about solving inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And just to complete this round, gentleman here.
Thank you. Chris Rolls, Age International. We're part of the Global Help Age Network, and in Netherlands, our counterpart is the rather memorably named World Granny. As well as listening to three excellent presentations, I've been thinking about the film that we saw at the beginning of today's meeting, and about the older woman about whom we learnt three things. We learnt about her role as a carer. We learnt about her role in the informal economy, which will have made her more vulnerable, of course. And we learnt about her health challenges. And her health will almost certainly have been the result of a lifetime's accumulation of inequality, including, of course, gender inequality. And she is in danger of being invisible in the indicators as they've been presented, because, to give just one or two examples, the measures that will be used to measure violence against women, gender-based violence, age at the end of the age of 49. So a quarter of the world's women will not be included in that measure. It makes the assumption that the issue of violence against women is linked only to reproductive age. And second, the indicator that relates to health and non-communicable diseases measures so-called premature mortality, which is inherently discriminatory. So I think it's clear where I'm coming from, but there is a real danger that older people will be left behind in the way in which currently the indicators are planning to measure some of these really key indicators. Now, of course, data, we know how important it is, and we know how important it is to be creative in finding new sources of data that will help to measure some of these things, because we know that the current data sources are based on maternal health sources and so on. So comments on how to include older people. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to, I think, take a pause there and invite some very brief responses and reflections from our panel, and then I'm going to move over this side of the room and start with you first, sir, first. Okay, who would like to minister? Would you like to respond first?
Yeah, let me just walk through the three questions. Thank you very much, and remarks. On mental health, I think it's really good that you singled out a group of people that has been forgotten in many cases. As you know, in July, there will be a debate on the indicators, and I think I understand your call as a question to really address people with mental illnesses in that agenda. Also, I think I'd like to mention that there's around 125 million people now in the world that are dependent on aid from others because they're refugees within their own country or out of their own country. That would be the 11th country of the world. So imagine that, 125 million people. In May, we will have a summit, a World Humanitarian Summit, on the needs of those people. And again, there in that agenda also, there's a strong need for care around traumas that people have. So also in that agenda, we are very much advocating to put the concerns and the needs of those people much more in the forefront than they have been. On the second issue on Zimbabwe, well, of course, sanctions are a political tool that is not easily decided upon, whether it's Zimbabwe or any other country. And there's always the dilemma that you might hit poor people that you don't want to affect. That's why I think many countries have been continuing to support civil society groups that cater to the needs, the basic needs of many people. But political disagreements, sometimes it's not enough to agree to disagree. Sometimes you have to make a strong case, and that's what we did in the case of Zimbabwe. On the issue of older women, well, I mean, let me just agree with what you've been said, and again, see it as an extra, an additional plea from the ones that we heard from here from World Granny to also make it part of our agenda, which I think you heard that it is, but it's good to single out older women because they're too easily forgotten in many sectors of life. So thanks.
There's some quick things. Zimbabwe, the African Union opposes sanctions on Zimbabwe. So as an African, I stand by that position as well. On the indicators questions, just an emphasis on this single registry. The SDGs, emphasize as a goal social protection. And I think the single registry concept works well on the ground in the sense that you find these multiple vulnerabilities and you pool them together. And so the different vulnerabilities go into one single registry for support, in which case that old lady cannot be ignored. And the second thing that I think is unique about the SDGs is that it allows for, national specific indicators and national specific progress against different starting points. And that's why the data collection issue is very important. There is a generally agreed, targets, but each of them may or may not be valid at local level. And so at local level, there are additional indicators that has to address the question of leave no one behind. As long as we keep that flexibility in mind, that we don't box it up back to an MDGs framework, where the ones that are mentioned are the only ones that has to be monitored, then I think we can partly address that problem.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely echo what you've said, Charles. I think one thing that's really important in the indicators discussion is to make sure that we're not locking ourselves into just what can be measured now, but it's a sort of an emerging data system that will allow for innovation and recognise, well, not just innovation in terms of kind of big data and new data collection techniques, but also improved data analysis. So, again, it's sort of become a truism that no data is collected on people over the age of 49. Actually, some of the big internationally comparable household surveys do collect that data, and it's just nothing's done with it. So it's both, making better use of the data we've got, but also recognising new sources of data, including, I would add, adding unofficial sources of data, so monitoring and evaluation, programmatic data from CSOs, and joining that, combining that in an interoperable way is the technical term, with official data sources. And I know that, for instance, I don't think I'm stealing anyone's thunder, because I think this is sort of partially known, that Save the Children is going, I'm pointing to my former colleague from Save the Children, is going to be opening up its data, its programmatic data soon, which is fantastic. And I think, I guess I'm putting the challenge back to you that this is, INGOs need to be the starting point for this.
Thank you very much, Liz. Right, we have time for another round. I'm going to just sweep right over to the other side of the room here, please. Gentleman at the front first. Rebecca, yeah.
Okay, good morning. My name is Mosharraf Hussain. I'm Director of Policy and Influencing of ADD International. I'm also representing the people who are often left behind in developing world. I came from Bangladesh. In September 2015, I think there's a real hope to people who are left behind, because disability and aging and other things are included in the global goals. The challenge is how we can implement or transform this goal into reality. I think two things are obvious that is discussed: the financing and monitoring. And I have few recommendations as well as observations. For the developing world, I think it is possible to reach that target of 20% tax burden if the tax system is restructured. And of course, we need reliable data. And in the developing world, from where I came, this is the need capacity of the statistics bureau. Then I think we can have that resources as well as reliable data that can give real picture of what is happening on the ground, whether people who are left behind are included in the development process or not. But now, as a representative of from the people of Lebanon and behind, I have three observations. First, I think I attended so many meetings in many parts in the globe, and I found the strong voice and role of British Prime Minister to promote this issue. But early when I see the aid strategy of defeat, then as a development worker, little disappointed, but as a person of live behind, I'm fully disappointed that this issue is not on the top priority of this agency. I'm not criticizing, but I am telling my reaction. Second one, Mr. Minister, when you were director of International Program of CODED, I was the country director of ADD Bangladesh, and we got from CODED nearly 15 years support. But last year, when we prepared ourselves to implement the program for Lebanon behind, CODED said we don't have money because the government reduced their funding. My speech is not for fundraising, but I am raising that is how your aid policies are affecting on the ground. And my third observation, in the World Economic Forum, the Secretary General declared 7 advocates to implement SDGs. But where is the representative of people of Lebanon behind? We want our participation. I think Secretary General should form another advocates ensuring representative of all marginalized people. Then we can see that our voice will be there. And Minister, you also mentioned that is, I'm very much appreciating, that is, you are now going to implement inclusive development. That is we want. But yes, there's women are there, and you also mentioned about youth people, but people with disabilities are 15% of any population. We are now 1 billion. And if we cannot control Zika virus, I think the prevalence will be higher and higher. So now we have to think that is really so that we the disabled people are not again left behind. The mistake what has been happened in Millennium Development Goal, it should not be repeated again. Thank you.
Thank you. Whoa.
Sorry.
No. Let me just move over here. Woman here in the blue T-shirt, and then the gentleman behind you.
Hi, it's Lauren Edmonds from Rescue Global. We are a disaster risk reduction and response unit. this is something that hasn't really been mentioned so far, but I just wanted to know what consideration needs to be given to the impacts of disasters in ensuring the needs of marginalised and vulnerable people are met in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. How can we ensure that they're not left behind if a disaster does strike?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very helpful to include that. And then, yes, sir.
Madam Minister, I've got a couple of questions. Quick one.
Very quick, please.
One is, my name is Rafiq. I'm from Micro, Small, Medium Enterprises. I've been few times, probably the last few years, 12 times to Bangladesh, and I'm working on poverty alleviation, employment generation projects there. I literally met all the microcredit heads there. My question is this, that look, how do we alleviate poverty? The two global menaces are poverty, unemployment. Now, the only way you can do it, by, so far as my knowledge is concerned, is by creating jobs. Now, how do you create jobs? For jobs, you need to develop skill development. Now, how do you do that? I mean, Europeans cannot probably offer that kind of money to go and invest in a bigger mega projects in Africa or in Middle East. So my question is this, that you do have enough money to promote skill development and which can immediately bring results. The last Millennium Development Goal was not successful because it was controversial. So 50% of the poverty alleviation was done in China. So my suggestion is another easy one for you, that all the people in Africa, Middle East, and Asia who have looted the money, that money for the last 30, 40 years is in Europe. So if you can come up with some kind of a law that if that money can be returned to these countries, I think it will be a great help. So you already have a money, and to discourage people from looting, because in my time when I was young, $1,000 corruption was enough. Now they talk about $1 billion corruption. So these politicians and corrupt businessmen are really crossing the limits. So the money is available. All these countries, even the developing, they've got the money. But if you can come up with some laws, because now people are really going for billions of dollars. So my suggestion is this, that please, if you can just tell me, how do we go about the skill development, and what are your views on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we can squeeze one more question in. Lady here on the floor.
Good morning. My name is Leonie Reimers. I work at the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thanks for inviting me. And sorry I was late. I flew in this morning and my flight was delayed. I just wanted to point to one thing which the lady from Rescue Global has already mentioned in one aspect. For the German government, it's extremely important that there are 3 dimensions to sustainable development. Not only social and economic, but also the environmental issue. And I think when we talk about leaving no one behind, it's not just disasters that strike the poorest worst, but it's pollution that strikes them worst. They've got the worst health services. They are the first to migrate when climate changes hit. So I would like to draw your attention to that, just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have some new issues on the table now, the whole question of disasters and environmental destruction. The question of corruption. If any of the colleagues from DFID in the audience would like to respond to the specific point, then you're most welcome. Okay, I will call on you in a minute. But for the rest of the panel, perhaps if we reflect specifically on what is the useful role of outsiders, be they INGOs or official aid agencies in this. We've heard very powerfully that this is primarily a national level agenda. But it's useful to think about, there is obviously also an international effort here, and what is the useful things that can be done. So let me perhaps reverse the order just for variety's sake, and start with Liz for this round. Thank you.
Thanks. And I really like the questions because it feels like we're getting to the heart of some of the really difficult issues here. And Charles, you talked about trade-offs and prioritisation. That's exactly the kind of thing that we're starting to talk about. I really like what you said about making sure that the people who are left behind are part of this kind of, if we're having a global political process, if we're going to have champions of Leave No One Behind, and I very much hope that we will, that those include the voices and people who've been left behind as well. I think that's really important. Just another data point. Actually, we're getting better disability data. There's something called the Washington Group Survey, which is a short and easily administered survey, easy to answer. It's being administered in 42 countries now. So there's, we're starting to build up that sort of knowledge of what's really going on. Thank you very much for sort of raising the indivisibility of the agenda. And I think it's, maybe I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it's actually a big research agenda looking at both the sort of interaction of conflict-affected states, disasters, humanitarian emergencies, other forms of disasters, and the kind of the environmental sustainability agenda, because I think it's very clear that, as you said, Leonie, that marginalised are the biggest and first victims of this. And I think there's a real dearth of knowledge and understanding and data on this to really know some of the answers. I'd say the same thing actually about job creation. Actually, there's a big gap in our knowledge. We know something about the supply side of it, the demand side of it. How do you build healthy, educated populations? At least we know in theory, if we're not always able to deliver it in practice, if governments aren't always able to implement it. But I think there's a lot less known about the supply side of it. If it's the left behind jobs for marginalised people, what do they need to look like? It's that kind of matching, and I think there's a big research agenda around it. Just on your question, Claire, about the role for outsiders, I think I'd go back to this point about the changing normative environment, that I think we all have a responsibility to make sure that the SDGs are delivered. And I think that it's, increasing support for civil society and people who are holding governments to account for delivery of the goals. For me, that's the key role that can be played.
Thank you, Charles.
On the environment, disaster and vulnerability links, I think it's important that this point has been drawn, because usually the poorest people face these things simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So in the part of the Ghana that I work in, desertification, the reduction of the tree cover, very unpredictable rainfall, microclimate problems exacerbate, the income problems. And so this interlinked and multi-sectoral approach emphasized by the SDGs is absolutely critical. We can't do incomes in a farming area as if it is only about the application of fertilizer. Mm-hmm. We have to deal with incomes in a dry land area alongside, protecting the environment, greening the spaces, protecting the water bodies, and so on and so forth. That's why this SDG sustainable development concept makes sense at the level of implementation. So it's a level of concept, but it's also a level of design. And I think this is absolutely critical in terms of the way we think about it. In terms of skills, I've always dreamed of old-fashioned aid systems returning in some form. Mm-hmm. Because in the part of the country that I work with, we have done well in putting as many people into primary and secondary schools as possible. We're opening new universities, private and public, but they are all roaming around. Mm-hmm. And so there's some very practical skills that are necessary. So I'm a very good friend of GIZ. There's a number of crazy GIZ people thinking practically about how we bring back vocational training and in a much more broader way, from housing construction to new ways of applying local knowledge to the maintenance of roads and pavements, to all these practical things that themselves add to and diversify the skill set, but eventually also provides an impetus for new ways of growth, because housing and real estate is becoming an important part of it. Just that, there's not sufficient skills that go into it. So some aid systems that go back very basic is also quite helpful in regenerating basic skill sets in many of these communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great questions. They all merit a speech, I would say, but I'm not going to give another one. But just let me touch briefly on 3 issues. One, the importance of having a voice and being visible on all fora. I mean, I of course, I agree. I think that's also the reason why we came up with a new fund, which is called Voice, to enable civil society groups to really, step up the plate and be visible. I also think, however, that there is a responsibility to all of us, governments, funders, the UN, to make sure that within our own program, there is that as a matter of fact, you constantly think about, am I not excluding anyone? I mean, on purpose, I'm not using the word mainstreaming. In my old feminist days, we used to call mainstreaming male streaming. I'm not a big fan of it. I'm still not, because I think it's too technical, and this is about political issues. So, for example, in our ambassadors conference this year, we will have a separate breakout session on how can we make sure that people with disabilities are part of our program, are invited, can participate. Are we really, actively engaging and inviting everyone? So that's one. The second is on disaster risk reduction. It's one of the key components of our climate policy. Of course, we're in mitigation, but we are investing a lot in adaptation. And all these larger funds, the Green Climate Fund and the Green Global Environmental Facility and whatnot, we are really specifically focusing and earmarking our budgets to be of the benefit of the poorest of the poor and women. There's lots of reasons why women are drowning first. It's because for cultural reasons they cannot learn to swim, or because they're in the areas that are hit hard. So I think all these factors need to be catered in, and that's what we really try to do in our policies. Then on the role of outsiders, of course there's a role for international NGOs, civil society, but there is a role for private sector in job creation. That's what they need to do. If you look at the way that the global economy is structured, it's more and more around global value chains. So if you're in Kenya, and Kenya is a tea-producing country, and you invite Unilever to come in and invest, they want to invest not only in the plants and in highbrow jobs. They also want to invest in the women who produce and pluck the tea. So talking to investors, foreign direct investors, and asking them or requiring them to invest in what is called local content is, I think, a key contribution that private sector needs to make, and a lot of, let me say, Dutch companies really want to make. So governments cannot create jobs. They can create an enabling environment, which is complex as it is, but the private sector needs to create jobs, pay people decently, make sure that they have decent working hours in safe environments. And that is also, I think, on this agenda, a key outsider with which I think governments need to be more aware of, and also need to be more in the driving seat and make sure that there is an enabling environment. If you don't have corruption, that's not only good for those large-scale investors, it's also good for the market women. So you really need to invest in that. So.
Thank you, Minister. And that those remarks remind me that I don't think we've heard a question or a comment from anybody from the private sector, broadly and loosely defined yet. So let me invite that for the next round. Did any colleagues from DFID want to come back? You were nodding when I offered the invitation, so let me...
Thanks very much, Claire. It's Gerard Howe here, Head of DFID's Inclusive Societies Department. Firstly, I just want to pay tribute to the leadership, Mr. Plowman, that the Netherlands has shown on this agenda. I thought your statement to Parliament was exemplary and really showed the sort of leadership that we all need at the moment. I find myself in the position, unusually, of disagreeing with Musharraf, actually, quite strongly on that. I think I would point you to the promise that is on the web that Prime Minister Cameron made on Leave No One Behind. 8 large commitments on there, the first of which is that we will respond to and listen to the voice of those most excluded. I think that we've got That's part of the gift that Claire referred to earlier on, and our challenge now is how we use that gift. But also what the strategy does is it points us, and many of the panelists have been talking about this today, to how we place Leave No One Behind not only at the heart of everything we do around poverty reduction, but also at the heart of everything we do on crisis response, at the heart, as Minister Plowman has been doing, at the heart of everything we do on growth, at the heart of everything we do on humanitarian action. That's the agenda going forward, and that's really where we need to make Leave No One Behind really apply. We can talk more about UK position in terms of partnership. We are starting up with colleagues in this room and talking to others going forward. I think the role of civil society is really important. It's both a challenge and an opportunity for civil society to be entirely relevant in this agenda, to give the contribution that we know they can, to promote the accountability that we want, and to create fundamentally the political environment at its largest to its smallest level that actually ensures that people are no longer excluded now and in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerard. Okay, I have a few interesting questions and comments have come through from our online audience. Hello, glad you're still there. And let me just, this is a question from Natalie Sharples from Health Poverty Action, who says current language in the global indicator discussions appears vague on the commitment to data disaggregation across all indicators versus only targets which reference specific population groups. Should we be worried about implications for Leave No One Behind? So I take that both as a rather very technical question on the indicator setting, but also really a more political question about whether this commitment to Leave No One Behind is going to be sustained as we move through the political process around the goals. And clearly the indicator discussion is the current political process that we're going through, and it's important that we maintain the commitment right the way through to the end of this process. And I also see that we have people in the room who've been very engaged in the sort of day-to-day debate on the indicator development. So let me also invite you, if you want to raise your hands after the respondents. Then we have a question from Rebecca Yaw of UCL and Rescue Global, where she says, addressing inequality is certainly a fundamental challenge. However, it's equally important for us to define the limits of a blanket classification of inequality and poverty. There are many indigenous communities that we may consider extremely poor in an economic sense, excluded from mainstream society, and so in need of a targeted development response. How can we ensure that when reaching out to isolated population groups, we respect traditional ways of life that live prosperously in their own right, which, again, I take both as a specific question, but also a broader policy and political question about how we ensure that Leave No One Behind is not something which is done to people, but is something which is done by them and very much informed by people's own priorities and perspectives, very much, in fact, as the SDGs themselves were developed, with the phenomenally huge consultation exercise, the biggest ever in the UN's history, and how to ensure that this tradition and this sort of commitment is taken through into the implementation phase. So with those two, let me invite now two more questions from the floor in this round. We've still got time for probably one more round if lady in the front here in the striped dress, and then you here.
Yeah. My name's Doreen McIntyre. I work independently with NGOs. I'd like to ask Minister Plowman, you made some very inspiring remarks right at the beginning. I'd like to take you back to them and ask you, how do we get our governments to fall out of love with billionaires?
Short and to the point. Thank you very much. And let me just come round here.
Hello, my name is Shazia Abbas. I'm CEO and founder of...
Can't hear you. Is the mic on?
Can you hear me?
Just speak up a bit.
My name is Shazia Abbas. I'm CEO and founder of a microfinance institution based in Pakistan. My question is basically if Mr. from Ghana, if he can share examples of if there is any community-based sustainable agriculture, especially.
That woke everybody up.
It's sustainable agriculture for, especially for women farmers, because we are having the same kind of problems. to ensure the food security.
Okay.
So that's an issue, and basically when it's coupled with a natural disaster like flooding every year, so how can we tackle that? And my other point is on if we have, how to respond to the challenge of energy shortages. Do we have enough alternative energy solutions especially for community and vulnerable?
Thank you very much indeed. I think we're seeing now how each round of questions brings in some new issues. So now we also have food and energy on the table. So we are seeing how the breadth of the agenda and the scale of the task in hand. Charles, I know you had some comments also relating to the last round, and let me also invite you to tackle these questions as well.
Okay. Minister, in the private sector, you used the term enabling environment, and you said it was a big enough issue. And that's really is the problem. That in the poorest communities, to get adequate private sector investment, both in generating domestic business people and bringing external business, external to the community, can be national or foreign. The experience is really that corruption is important, but it's usually the furthest down the line. What is often required, and from experiences around the world, is it requires a lot of public sector investment to draw in private sector. So I give an example in my area. It's a huge area. There's a lot of water resources, very small population settlement, large land, good for agriculture, sustainable, small, commercial, all put together. For a company to invest in this area requires significant public investment in infrastructure, even in irrigation systems. Irrigation systems are exceedingly expensive. It's the only thing that turns an apparently dry area into a productive area. No private sector is coming to use private sector money to generate the bulk water infrastructure. That's public sector. That's the starting point. So where the public sector capability is weak in that area, private sector investment response is weak simultaneously. That's an issue to remain, and that brings us back to that whole debate about infrastructure funds and infrastructure programs. It's absolutely critical. Secondly, even when the infrastructure conditions are done, as I said earlier, risk assessment often tends to create a situation where the private sector is passing on the risk burden to the state in the form of various forms of guarantees. You're either doing a commercial guarantee, which means that the state still has to find some money, one form or the other, to commercially guarantee, or sovereign guarantee, which is generating international debt in its books. So it's not a straightforward issue in that sense. So in promoting the private sector significantly, we have to think about the public sector capability to do so going forward. Two quick things. There was a specific suggestion, question about sustainable agriculture. In our part of the world, we consider all our agriculture as largely sustainable. Most of our people are in food production. They produce their yam, which they largely eat, and they sell the rest, or sorghum and millet. During the dry season, if there is a water, irrigation or a dam or underground water source, you do vegetables so largely it is this, but it's inadequate as a source not only for feeding themselves all year round, but generating incomes to meet other needs. And therefore, you have to invest in some form of an expansion in the production process without necessarily adulterating the quality of the food which is being produced. Brings us back to infrastructure, whether it is small irrigation systems or medium to large-scale irrigation systems. It comes out all the time going forward. On energy is the same thing. There are different energy solutions to this, including rooftop solar. But again, our experience, I think ODI has been involved in this rooftop solar discussion, is that, again, it requires a lot of state capability to stimulate a private sector response to rooftop solar. Comes constantly back to the capability of the state to actually stimulate this. But options are there. But investing in the basics to get the private sector off the ground is the main constraint.
Thank you, Charles. Minister, let me turn to you.
Let me. I'm going to leave the indicator question to Liz. I do think that she knows a lot more about those indicators and where we are at a technical level, and then than I do, and then I will carefully listen and take it to the political tables. I do understand where the remark comes from that we have to respect traditional ways of life. So let me start by saying that. However, having said that, I don't know of any traditional way of life, including the one that I come from, that really values the position and the role of women as actors for change, as human beings by themselves with rights. Too many times what we call traditional ways of life involve beating up women, having dowries, giving your children or mutilating your children with gender mutilation. So, I mean, I do understand the call that we should not in one sweep, Americanize everyone, but let us also continue to be very conscious that tradition is usually not in favor of women and girls. Then fall out of love with the billionaires. Yeah, in my country, I mean, we have a fair taxation, I would say, which also affects billionaires. There are some billionaires that actually do quite good things. Last week, we had Bill Gates coming to the Netherlands, and there are others too who have managed to use their billions, basically, to do the right things, because they also reach out to people who know the right things and together with them come up with an agenda. I do think that fair taxation globally is the best way to make sure that everyone contributes progressively and that the market woman is not paying more than, the large factory owner. My final remark is on food security and coming back to the private sector and the need for a strong public sector. I think we're all in agreement on this. If you look at food security, in a country, in India, 30% of what is produced goes to waste because of post-harvest losses. And those post-harvest losses are there because there's no infrastructure, not for the small farmer, but also for the larger ones. And so investments in infrastructure, and I think globally you see a lot of financial institutions, the World Bank, but not only them, really step up their efforts to invest in infrastructure is very much needed. There are some interesting public-private partnerships here on Grow Africa, Grow Asia, that really work with small-scale farmers to raise their productivity levels, which is much more than only fertilizers. I mean, that's just a very small part of it. It is about vocational training. It's about making agriculture sexy again for young people. My grandfathers and mothers all were in agriculture. And, moving up the ranks is not so much, at that time, was not considered having a larger farm. It was, ending up behind a desk with a white collar or becoming a minister. Making sure that young people see agriculture as a way to have a career and move up the ranks is in all parts of the world, I think, a responsibility that we need to take much more seriously.
Thank you very much.
So on the, turning back to the indicator question, I mean, so should we be worried about the state of disaggregation in the indicators now? So I think there's a couple of places where there's a disjunct between language and commitments in the goals and targets and the groups that have been specifically name-checked for disaggregation. So there's a couple of instances of sort of race and ethnicity being mentioned in the goal or the target, but not being mentioned in the indicators. And I think that's an area where we should be concerned. There is some who are concerned that, in fact, you're not saying that there should be disaggregation across the full range of groups for every single indicator, across all the targets. I can see the concern that if it's not listed here, it means that later on it's more likely that governments implementing this are not going to disaggregate as fully as possible. But on the other hand, I think we do need to be take into consideration what is practical, but also there are some ethical considerations around this. So particularly with LGBTI groups, there may be some ethical issues around identification. So I think actually having that blanket approach may not be the perfect solution either. Maybe it's being just more specific and naming each indicator and the specific disaggregation for each one. And again, being clear that this can move and change as our knowledge base increases. But that links actually nicely to the other point, which was, the right of people not to be developed or not to be left behind that you were speaking to, Minister. There was a great piece in The Guardian on this, I think on Friday or over the weekend, making exactly this point, that if you're from a minority group, you may want to protect your lifestyle. You may not want to sort of, have this all pervasive fingers of the government or the private sector or somebody coming to change you. And I think, again, the solution to that is going back to this idea of listening to the voices of the poor, having participatory research, having the voices of marginalised people in the room and listening to what they want, what they need, what they're getting, what they're not getting. So the My World survey, that sort of approach of asking people what they want, maybe it's focus groups, maybe it's something more sort of qualitative and in-depth, but making sure that they're represented. I think that's how you deal with both the ethical issues, some of the disaggregation gaps as well, and making sure that this is something that's feasible on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Liz. No, let me just abuse my position for a minute to second that very wholeheartedly. I mean, I think, Liz mentioned the My World survey, which ODI had a hand in developing. And I, had enormous political traction during the creation of the SDGs. And I think it's absolutely essential that we keep that door open. And really, when we talk about data gaps, we have all of the data gaps that we know about. But in addition, we have a huge data gap on what people think, what people value, when we think about the sort of opinion surveys and perceptions data that is collected almost daily from populations of richer countries. There's a really shocking lack of similar kinds of information about what people think, collected in a way which is systematic, representative and useful to governments when it comes to the very poorest people in societies. So I think that is another data gap that urgently needs to be filled here. We are almost out of time. And bearing in mind that any future questioners are standing in the way of a very large group of people and their lunch, I have one question here from a colleague in the front, and one, I think this is a really interesting point from one of our online audience, from Katushi Imai at the University of Manchester Economics Department. He says, Minister, directing this specifically to you, to tackle both global and domestic inequality you discussed, we need to motivate multinational firms to become more self-aware of poverty and to generate a system where these firms are actively engaged in contributing to poverty alleviation. What do you think, the questioner says, what are the different ways that the government can influence private sector decision-making through public policies to try to create the incentives to shift them in that direction? And let me also invite my colleague in the front here to just ask, and then you've been waiting a long time too, so the last two questions and then we will finish.
Thank you very much, and sorry about lunch. Andrew Shepherd, ODI. I've got a couple of questions actually. It was great to see the film about Northern Ghana, where I began my work on development many, many moons ago, and to hear Charles talking about it as well. The kind of things that you were talking about, Charles, are kind of long-term structural issues and trends. And I suppose it set me to wondering, do you see the political commitment to making the kind of necessary changes to keep the North in the mainstream, or put the North in the mainstream there more today than at other times? Ghana is, a democracy that we like to think is one of the better ones, and so political competition should be, in theory, leading to that kind of result. I'd be very interested to hear your current reflection on that. And then relate it also to the data question. Is there a chance that the Ghanaian government will, under your leadership perhaps, invest in the kind of data that the rest of the panelists and many in the audience have been talking about in the next 3 years? Is it going to happen? And my second point was about private sector development, which has been discussed quite a bit. The Chronic Poverty Advisory Network that I work with produced a policy guide on private sector development, which took a bit of a different view from the normal discussion on private sector development. It argued that it's really the informal economy that needs to be focused on here, because that's where poor people get access either to jobs or self-employment. And of course, not to the exclusion of focusing on foreign direct investment and so on, but it's a really important focus. Governments don't tend to recognize, and international agencies don't tend to recognize the informal economy. It's not counted. There's no good statistics on it. It doesn't appear properly in national accounts, etc., etc. And what we said was that if you really want poor people to access better private sector development, if you like, you need a combination of things. One is social protection, which we've talked about. Another one is the sort of financial and business development services, but at that level of the informal economy. And then the third one is the training and capabilities. But these are all critical agendas. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Muller from Safe World, a conflict prevention organization. And I think I just wanted to draw attention to people in conflict-affected and fragile context, because OECD estimated last year that in 2030, around 62% of the world's extreme poor will be located in conflict-affected and fragile context. So I just wanted to pose the question, what do you think are the specific measures that need to be taken to ensure that these people are not left behind? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A really important reminder. Okay. That, I'm afraid, was the end of the questions. So let me invite the panellists now to respond to those specific points, and also please to make any final remarks that you'd like to make, summing up the discussion. I'm going to start with Liz, and then Charles, and then finally, Minister, I turn to you.
Thanks. So, yeah, on your point about conflict-affected people, I mean, I think that the first thing that you'd need, and it's an obvious point, I think you need a peace settlement that is truly inclusive and is going to be lasting. Now, if you get back to the question of the 1,000-day agenda and how much of that is achievable within the first 3 years, that's more problematic. But I think by breaking down sort of policy initiatives and looking at the steps that that governments need to implement to get to some final goal, we've got, although we're urging urgent action, this is a 15-year agenda, and it's right to be really ambitious for this agenda. And so if we are looking for those peaceful, inclusive settlements, then being very clear on what part of that, let's not reject it because it seems like something that's very difficult. Let's break down what part of it can be achieved in the first 3 years, where you build some kind of hope amongst populations that this thing is possible. And then you go into, what happens next, what are the next steps after that to make it really embedded in something that's sustainable. I just wanted to end on a note of optimism and hope, which is partly, as we've all said, this newfound political will that so many different donors and developing country governments are now talking about this agenda, civil society groups, this is now high on their agenda. The new, I'm forgetting its precise title, but the new Commission on Sustainable Development and Businesses, so the business and the SDGs, they've got Leave No One Behind as one of the core things that they're looking at, which I think, that's not something you would have seen 5 years ago. But thinking about bottom of the pyramid marketing maybe, but not about your core business and how you change it to respond to this agenda. So that's really exciting, as we've all said. But the fact that it's becoming increasingly clear that this, although you may think that dealing with intergenerational inequalities, entrenched marginalisations, things that require behavioural, social change, that these are really, really insurmountable problems. Actually, I think that there's a range of kind of policy case studies from around the world, including from countries like, we're talking about South Africa, that now has, a minimum wage for domestic workers. It's possible in every context. Eritrea is doing some of this, introducing Leave No One Behind policies. So I want to leave on that note of optimism that we're part way towards knowing what needs to be done. Some countries are part way towards delivering what needs to be done. And I think the additionality of the SDGs means that now is really the moment to make this happen.
Thank you, Liz. Charles.
Specific questions on Ghana, northern Ghana. Actually, this is coming at a really good time for Ghana, because we have just embarked upon a long-term national development planning process at very early stages. What we've done is first go around all the regions and do consultations about people's ambition, expectation, It's very rich material on that. We actually, before I left, we convened, we had a meeting on statistics. We're going to do it in 2 steps. One is starting with northern Ghana, which is a SADA zone, because we will deploy some of the tools that the Millennium Promise used in their health work to do the baseline data. And that will be a learning point to scale up across the country. So in terms of the data, yes, the public government will invest in it, but only as much as government can. So it's usually a little bit of what they have and a little bit of going around and begging for whosoever will put in there, a little bit of innovation and creativity so we can collect this as cheap as we possibly can. And this is why this mobile telephony thing is important as a tool. In fact, we've piloted it in the health sector because we are planning to launch a community health workers program. So we're recruiting 20,000 health workers, community health workers this year. Most of it is in the SADA zone, the northern part, to basically scale up community health work. That's entirely funded by the government, in addition to the rest of it. So the data systems generated through that is largely public sector funded. But it will need some help. On the broader question of whether we can stick over a long term politically to an idea of addressing leaving no one behind, which is addressing the structural inequalities between the northern half of the country and the rest of the country. That's always $1 million question. But SADA was created by law to do this. So the Savannah Accelerated Development Authority was created by law to do extra things with some extra powers to try to address those long-term inequalities. Can they throw it out over time? Of course. Over time, laws can be changed, institutions can be restructured. It's a constant process of negotiating and bargaining. That's why I made the point at the beginning that no deal is permanently done. There's a moral, there's a normative issue. You have to keep making the point, but also proving that it has value for the rest of the country, as you do that. So, yes, good indication, but no, there are no guarantees going forward. On the informal economy, see, in my zone, 95% of our economy is informal. So that's not so. Any labor sector surveys deal with the informal economy. Our problem is to deal with, the poor of the future, which is all these young people which are pouring out of school who cannot all join the informal sector at its rate of growth without creating new vulnerabilities into the society. So we have to change the structure of the economy, even as we do things about microfinance and rural banking services and training on small businesses. We have to make agriculture sexy. It has to employ people. It has to be somewhere that you go in there, not only as a farmer, but because you trained in extension service and providing extension service. You trained in soils and therefore providing a services in soil, nutrient regeneration or whatever it is. Or that you are trained in fertilizer and so you're composing fertilizer. So new jobs have to come from a structural change of the economy. That's why we can't do either or the other. We have to do both going forward. Final thing on conflicts. One of the things we fear, of course, is new conflicts. So we are managing the ones that are, people coming out of it. But as long as there's these extreme levels of poverty and unemployment in young people, radicalism is always at the gate. And so we have to try and work at reducing the vulnerabilities to violent conflict. And that fundamentally is also about inclusion and economic transformation.
Thank you, Charles. Minister.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just following up on the issue of conflict. The Netherlands was one of the countries that has been advocating very strong to make this also part of the SDGs. Again, one can make a speech on that issue, but just a few remarks. One, I think, is that it's key to continue to invest in civil society in conflict-ridden areas, and that the voice of women is one of the voices that is not always heard, but needs to be part of that, let me say, civil society involvement. That needs protection of the political space that civil society needs, but it also needs financing. And it's also, that's one of the reasons that we created the Addressing Root Causes Fund, which is specifically geared towards funding civil society. So I think if you work in those areas, and you were very right to point out that those will be the areas where the poorest of the poor live. The poorest of the poor need to have an opportunity to be part of the solution, not only for themselves, but also at a national level. Then on, again, private sector development and the role of the informal sector, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what has been said. And of course, for everyone, when you engage in private sector development, one needs to be very much aware of the informal sector. Agriculture, large part in many countries, is informal sector. And one of the key components, I would say, to have that informal sector being involved is to also make sure that people in the informal sector, market women, small-scale farmers, have the opportunity to organize themselves. So one of the models that we've been working on in the Netherlands is this multi-stakeholder approach, where you have Unilever, for example, as a big foreign direct investor coming in, trying to increase productivity in a sensible way, but also to have them link up with local NGOs to help farmers organize themselves so that they can speak out, speak up, negotiate right prices, and be a voice in that multi-stakeholder approach. So I think organizing, we've been saying that for decades, and many of you have an activist background. Organizing is still key. That's not something that we're done with. On the question on public policies, well, obviously, yes. In my government, I'm not only the Minister for Aid, but I'm also the Minister for Trade. And we've put inclusive economic growth at the heart of our policies. So you can do it as an outsider, promoting policies, but you also need to do it inside your own country and work with governments to make that happen. Now, there's, again, lots to be said about this. I just would refer the gentleman to the documents that we made some years ago when this portfolio was created, and we're building and learning as we go on what kind of public policies you can use, ranging from multi-stakeholder approaches to fair global taxation, and a lot of it connected to that: decent work, decent pay, living wage, not only minimum wage, but also living wage. All that is part of that agenda.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm not, you'll be glad to know, going to try to sum up that exceptionally rich and wide-ranging conversation, but just to say that I think what we have laid out here is both a slightly daunting agenda when one thinks about the scale of the challenge, but I think also, as several of the panelists have said, really critically illustrates the interconnection between these things, interconnection at different levels between sectors. We've heard a lot about the economic transformation that is needed, but also the different social policies that are essential, both as parts of that economic transformation and also as a way of sharing the benefits of it. And the kind of interconnection between sectors and policy areas. We've heard also about the interconnection between actors, the way that public and private sectors, for example, have to absolutely work together and all have their roles in this agenda. The same goes for the various different development partners at the official and the non-governmental level, all engaged in this effort. So I think we have a strong sense of the breadth of the agenda, but also the connections and the way in which these things work together, and the way, hopefully, that if we get it right, pulling on one of the strings can unravel a lot of the spider's web in all sorts of different places. And the critical thing will be finding both the ways to work together. There are no magic bullets here. There are no simple levers to pull. This is going to be much more about a process than about pressing buttons. But if we can find both the right ways to work together and the right things to do together, then I think, we certainly have the best opportunity that we have had for a long time to really make progress on the multifaceted economic, social, political, environmental aspects of this agenda. So a huge thanks to the panel, to you for listening. Let me invite you all to join us for lunch next door. To those of us who are online, please have the appropriate meal for the time of day, and think hard about the discussion that you've heard. But first of all, please can we give a huge thanks to the Minister, to Liz and to Charles.